Hey Ecofictologists, my name is Lovis and I hope you're ready to do some learning because I've got a lot to share with you today. For anything else on my channel to make sense to you, I've got to go through some terms so we don't lose anybody. I'll try not to make this sound like I'm reading a dictionary, and I'll try and give you examples along the way. And don't worry if you don't quite catch the names of the books or the authors, I'll be linking them all in the description below. There are quite a few hashtags and classifications flying around that end up pointing in generally a similar direction. We have ecofiction, eco-literature, clifi, solarpunk, hopepunk, ecopunk, nature-oriented writing, Anthropocene fictions. But don't worry, I'm going to take you through the most common of these so you know the lay of the land. All definitions in this video are my best understanding of the genres, but I encourage you to leave your own thoughts down in the comments and subscribe to my channel if you want to have more conversations like this. So go grab that cup of tea, make sure you're comfortable, and let's get into it. On this channel I want to delve into all of the hashtags and all of the categories, and I don't want to limit myself to just one, which is why I wanted the name of my channel to include Ecofiction, which can be seen as an umbrella term for the rest of them. Ecofiction, when we boil it down to its most concise definition, is fiction where nature and the relationship between humanity and their physical environment play a major role in the plot. The reason that I say ecofiction is an umbrella term is that some of the other categories that we'll go through focus more specifically on one portion of the natural world, like man-made climate change or anthropogenic impacts. But ecofiction also covers just admiring nature's beauty and innate value, and non-human events and situations. Ecofiction as a concept is not new. The term was coined in the early 1970s and continued to grow in popularity throughout that decade alongside the growth of the conversation on environmental issues. However, many examples predate this decade that are still considered ecofiction. In fact, if you want to be extreme, Jim Dwyer's Where the Wild Books Are, A Field Guide to Ecofiction, picks out examples from the 19th century, like Moby Dick, which was surprising. However, most examples of this genre are from the 1970s onwards, with the notable exception of J.G. Ballard's Drowned World, which is often referred to as being ahead of its time and sits securely in the ecofiction genre. The 70s and 80s then gave us some of the most prominent examples of ecofiction that we know of. The Dune series by Frank Herbert, Richard Adams' Watership Down, the film version of which gave me nightmares as a child. Several titles by Margaret Atwood, including The Edible Woman and Surfacing, and Ursula Le Guin's The Word for World is Forest, and The Dispossessed. And of course, Ernest Callenbach's Ecotopia. The list of course continues to this day, with many names being added to the greats over the decades, with Kim Stanley Robinson, Paolo Bacigalupi, and Barbara Kingsolver being only a few of them. Ecofiction technically is not a genre in and of itself because it can span genres and cross genres, and ecofiction can be found in anything from dystopian sci-fi to romance to mystery. So there's something here for everybody. In order to get a bit more specific within ecofiction, several other subgenres have gained some traction. The most well-known of them is probably climate fiction, shortened to clifi to make an intuitive link to sci-fi from which it was born. It focuses specifically on man-made climate change rather than unstoppable natural disasters such as erupting volcanoes or meteorites hitting the Earth that might have led to dystopian futures in books of the previous decade. Kat Sparks, one of the editors of the anthology Ecopunk, Speculative Tales of Radical Futures, put it really nicely. It uses scientific data to translate climate change from the abstract to the cultural, building a bridge connecting scientific information with people preparing to face an uncertain future the past can no longer be relied upon to guide us through. In 2007-2008, journalist Dan Bloom coined the term clifi and has since become one of its greatest advocates, starting and maintaining the first blog dedicated completely to clifi. While it may have started out as sci-fi, it has definitely expanded since then and can be found across several genres. As a sweeping general statement, much of what constitutes clifi does fall into this near-future dystopian classification. Cory Doctorow's Walkaway, Paolo Bacigalupi's Wind-Up Girl and The Waterknife, and Omar Akkad's American War, just to name a few. Often climate change acts as an amplifier to cultural, economic, societal, or health issues, putting so much pressure on them that the way that we handle them starts to unravel. Climate change can therefore be represented in a number of different ways, much like we are experiencing it in a number of different ways in our day-to-day lives. Temperature change is a big one, but also sea level rise, droughts, extreme weather events, spread of diseases, food shortages, etc. Often these settings will set the backdrop for the main plot. So clifi doesn't necessarily have to be about how we deal with climate change specifically. The plot can be about how we deal with something else that has arisen thanks to the position that climate change has put us in. But clifi also doesn't have to be speculative, which means to speculate about the future, or reimagining the past or present if things were different. It can also examine climate change narratives in today's world too, with scientific data that exists right now. Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior is a common favourite, which focuses on the changing seasonal and weather patterns in one part of the world, shifting a species' range towards more moderate climates, where maybe it was never seen before. In the author's notes in the back, Kingsolver talks about real-world events that inspired her to write this book. Inspiration is, unfortunately, not in short supply. Because climate fiction, as the name suggests, does focus so specifically on man-made climate change, it doesn't encompass many of the other anthropogenic impacts we are having on our natural environment that do not have to do with greenhouse gas emissions or fossil fuels. These things could be illegal wildlife trade, landscape destruction and fragmentation, deforestation, pollution of waterways, overfishing, you name it. These are still ways in which we are pushing our natural systems to the limit, even if they don't get as much attention as climate change does. This is what we call Anthropocene fiction. The Anthropocene is the period in which human activity is the driving influence on the world's climate, and arguably starts with the Industrial Revolution. And Anthropocene fiction documents these actions and their consequences in literature. This term isn't as widely used as some of the others that I will discuss in this video because it's not very catchy and people tend to go either narrower or broader in their classification. Before we go on, I want to say that these categories are maybe not as discrete as their definitions make them sound, and many books can be classified into several of them. Think of it kind of like a Russian doll. So far we've got Big Mama, we've got Ecofiction, we open her up, we find Anthropocene fiction, and we open her up, and then we find clifi inside. Okay, moving on, let's talk about Solarpunk and Ecopunk. It was actually kind of difficult to nail down a definition for these two because everyone seems to have their own definition for them and they overlap a lot, but I'll give it my best shot. Now, anything with the suffix punk at the end probably makes you think of images like this from Altered Carbon or Blade Runner. But what lies at the core of any punk fiction is a rebellion against the status quo. A struggle against the system, be it big corporations, oppressive governments, or restrictive societal norms. It's a counterculture movement or set of ideals, and is often referred to as the fire starter, the length of rope used to ignite fuses. Punk is intended to ignite societal change. It also tends to have some kind of focus on technology or industry. Both of these categories, Solarpunk and Ecopunk, focus on imagining a better, greener, more sustainable future that leads to a utopia, and are by definition fairly optimistic. Their punkness manifests in the resistance against the idea that we have no control over how we experience and interact with nature. We would have to make radical changes in our behavior to get to this utopia and rebel against the consumer-driven capitalist society that we have now. A utopian future doesn't just passively arrive. We have to actively get there. Where the genres differ are the technologies that they use and the narratives that they focus on. It's hard to say which is broader, so I'm just going to say that our Russian doll had fraternal twins. Solarpunk really started as a genre in 2012 when a Brazilian anthology was published with the title Solarpunk, Ecological and Fantastical Stories in a Sustainable World. It has now been translated into English and I will link to that in the description below. Solarpunk as a strategy is very political and emphasizes autonomy, diversity, consent, egalitarian distributions of power, and freedoms for all groups of people. But it also focuses on using the technology that we already have, almost looking sideways for what already exists and moving it forward towards this utopian future, where we've overcome our negative impacts on the planet and now live in harmony with nature. While much of the technology focuses on cities and communities being solar-powered, it's kind of in the name, it also looks at permaculture and vertical farming, wind and tide energy, and so on. So let's be clear, the utopian idea is not necessarily that we stop all progress now, that we undo everything and we go back to our roots in a very low-tech society. Instead, it's about channeling progress into a different direction and with different values to get to a sustainable future. That doesn't mean that we don't try and heal some of the damage that we've done, revitalizing watersheds, bringing back pollinator populations, rewilding gardens. These are all Solarpunk too. The fact that it focuses on technologies that are already around and bringing back ecosystem functions that we've lost or are at risk of losing is probably why it hasn't stayed just a literary genre. It is also a social movement which started in 2014 on Tumblr of all places. In fact, more people are actively being Solarpunks than are writing about it. It has expanded into the fields of fashion, art, architecture, music, and it has its complete own aesthetic. I mean, who wouldn't want to live here? It's a literary genre that exists in the real world. On an episode of the Occulturcast, guests Gordon White and Jay Springett talked about Solarpunk as a genre and a movement, and they made a very interesting point about modern popular culture. Superhero movies are very popular at the moment in the industry, and while they are very entertaining, they do perpetuate a slightly dangerous idea that someone will come and save you. This existential crisis is far too big for you to handle. You should wait for a supernatural being to come and conquer it. And that takes the pressure off of the common person to take action. You might be waiting a long time for some supernatural being to kick climate change's butt. Solarpunk puts the emphasis on you having the power to change your interaction with nature and rebels against this idea that someone's going to come and do it for you. Okay, let's look at Solarpunk's twin, Ecopunk. Similar, but not identical. While Solarpunk focuses on today's technology maximized to get us to this new, green, sustainable future, Ecopunk focuses more on the journey to get there. What infrastructure is in place? How does trade work? People still need to make a living in this utopian world. Solarpunk celebrates inclusivity and diversity, and while Ecopunk does that too, it does acknowledge the fact that there will still have to be people at the bottom. Someone's got to harvest the food, transport the goods, make the clothes, build the machines. Who are they? Where are they? And what are their lives like? While these things might be working in the background of a Solarpunk narrative, where this world already works, Ecopunk puts them on main stage and makes them the point of the narrative. From what I gather, Ecopunk is perhaps a little nearer future than Solarpunk because it does focus on this journey. It has a little bit more agitation. It still has a bit of the darker side. So it's not dystopian. It's still very optimistic because we are moving towards a better future. But things like organized crime, corruption, illegal resource hoarding, those are still things that exist. I'll really quickly just mention Hopepunk, which also shares this vision of a better future, but the driving force behind getting there is hope. So instead of looking externally for activism and technologies, they look internally to dig themselves out of this hole. It isn't as radical, it doesn't have to be a big protest, it can be simple, it can be local. This genre doesn't inspire very much action as a movement, but it does give people hope, which is also very important. So there we have it, the whole family. We've got Big Mama Ecofiction, we've got the big but shy sister Anthropocene Fiction, we've got clifi, the outspoken one, maybe sometimes a bit pessimistic. We've got the twins, Ecopunk and Solarpunk, always jostling for space, but will team up to get something they want. And we've got the cousin that comes to the family reunion sometimes, Hopepunk. Big Mama's been busy. Which genre do I like best? That's a hard question. I think that they all serve a purpose. Solarpunk and Ecopunk give me hope, and they inspire action, which is what these genres are supposed to do. Some of the other broader categories focus on topics that are also really important to raise awareness of the situation right now. So I would recommend reading broadly in all of the genres and maybe match it to your mood. If you're feeling kind of low, maybe don't go for a dystopian clifi. Just a thought. I hope this helped give you an idea of the range of these genres and maybe gave you a starting point to start your own ecofiction library. So get reading, Ecofictologists, and I'll see you next week.